Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Dino Bidala. Today we're with award-winning journalist Hala Gorani. You know her for years of anchoring on CNN. Now she's with NBC News, and she has a brand new book out, But You Don't Look Arab and Other Tales of Unbelonging. Hala, welcome to Salon Talks. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So I've known you for years. You've interviewed me a few times. So this is the first time I get to ask you questions. And your book's a great book. Congratulations on it.
Thank you.
You have a line in there where you write, born in one country, raised in another, with parents from somewhere else entirely. Mm-hmm. Tell us about your journey, how all of this makes sense.
Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it didn't growing up. Now, of course, I've come to make peace with my set of overlapping identities. My parents are from Syria originally, born in Aleppo. They moved to Seattle, Washington, before I was born. I was born there. My parents split up when I was 6 years old. My mom moved to France, so I moved with her there. French became my native tongue, even though English is now my strongest language because I've been working in English as a journalist for 25, 26 years. And then Arabic, of course, is that language spoken at home, and Arabic food, and going back to Syria before the war, summers, etc. So I'm married to a German who's right there sitting off camera. I live in London. I mean, I don't know how many more. I was partly brought up in Algeria. So there is so much going on that it's always been a lifelong search for me to try to figure out who I am. And really, it's a natural human impulse, I think, to know what makes us who we are, really.
And have you figured that out?
I think I've figured out writing this book. I've kind of, I figured out that the journey itself is maybe where I belong, and it's what attracted me to journalism. It's what attracted me to being a foreign correspondent, to trying to find my story reflected in other people and the people that I cover. And I write in the book about being in Haiti and meeting this shopkeeper, and recognizing the pale-skinned man and asking him where he's from. And when he said Syria, I was like, brother, in the middle of this post-apocalyptic, post-earthquake, miserable situation, recognizing something in a perfect stranger in yourself.
It's also interesting in your book, you write about your great-grandmother who was in the Sultan Abdulaziz's harem.
Yeah.
I've never met anyone who had a family member in a harem, but I don't think it's what people think. It's a little bit what they think, but it's not exactly what they think, the way you explain it. Share a little bit about that and your great-grandmother.
Well, I did research into my family, and women are very poorly covered in history. I mean, we have photos of my male ancestors wearing the fez and the Ottoman military uniform, but women were rarely photographed. Their stories were rarely highlighted because they weren't stories of sort of typical, accomplishment in the male sense. They don't rise in the ranks of the military. They don't become ministers of security. So I went down that path, and I learned that in the Ottoman Empire, and I'd heard this story told through the female members of my family, that my great-great-grandmother during the Ottoman Empire had been taken against her will, kidnapped, and then inducted into the Sultan's harem. And this was not uncommon. Women who came from the Slavic areas of the Ottoman Empire that extended all the way into Bulgaria, into what is now the Circassian Mountains, would be, taken because of how they looked. Because it was considered, this is the effect of colorism at the time that still exists today. The pale, the blue-eyed, the high cheekbones. This is kind of where some of my physical features come from.
So your great-grandmother who was in the harem, but also in there you talk about, there's the being abducted against their will is horrible, obviously. But that they also, it's not like in the movies where there's just women in a tent waiting for the Sultan.
Right.
These women are educated in a way, intentionally, almost to be women of society. And I never thought of that part of it.
It's very interesting because the word slavery has a connotation in this country, which is a little bit not different, because obviously these women were the victims of a form of sexual slavery.
Right,
There's no doubt about that. But they were slaves and at the same time women of society. They were masters of other slaves, but at the same time they were the objects of the toys, the objects of kind of the will of the men, of the sultans, and of the higher ranking women. So there was this constant contradiction and pull in their lives, but ultimately they were not the mistresses of their own destinies, and that much is very clear.
In your book you go through the history of Syria and the role that Europe colonization played. Why was that important for you to share with people the real history of a country that doesn't get much press except during the time of the Civil War?
Right. Well, because I think the history of colonialism in that part of the world informs a lot of what we're seeing today. So much of what causes the tension, the strife, the sectarian wars. Now, let's put some of those are the responsibility, of course, of the leaders of the region. Not everything is the result or the fault of the colonial history of those countries, but it is some of the starting point of what led to where we are today. These completely artificially created countries that essentially don't always make logical sense. Lebanon is an example, of a country where you have a north, a south, and a center that are three very disparate sectarian groupings, kind of cobbled together by the French colonial masters, and in Syria as well. And it's also the story of kind of a time that is there's a certain nostalgia, despite the fact that Syria was a French mandate, from my mother's generation, where they were educated in French schools and the Jesuit religious institutions, which were the high level kind of elite academic institutions in Syria. So I talk about that also just to kind of, I think, share with the reader some of what makes Syria a much more complex story than what we see in the news every day.
Yeah, and if people know the history, they might have some understanding of what's happening today.
Yeah.
And they don't always. In my family's side, my dad's Palestinian, that it was the British mandate of Palestine. So they were colonized by the British at one point, in a way they took control of it after World War I. But we also share something else, especially you, I think, your book title, But You Don't Look Arab, which I've gotten all the time. Well, I'm half Arab, half Italian, so I am Mediterranean looking, but it also tells you what people think Arabs should look like when they say that. So what has it been like for you when people say to you, but you don't look Arab? Do you have a set of responses you usually give, or?
I have a whole paragraph kind of rehearsed, I was born there. I mean, exactly what we discussed here at the beginning. But I think also I try to tell people that like any population, like any ethnic grouping, people don't all look the same. I mean, it's not like we're all like flying in on a carpet and all come out right out of Aladdin kind of thing.
Right.
And I think that I like being able to tell people that this part of the world is actually very much the product of human migratory flows that have kind of come in and out of what we call the Near East, from Europe and then on to other parts of Asia and the Far East for centuries. And of course, then ultimately you're going to have people who look like you and me.
Well, it's mixed, but also I think so much of our fellow Americans' understanding of what an Arab should look like is from film and TV.
Yeah.
From the year, especially pre-9/11 movies where they were casting Indian and Latino Americans to play Arabs because they wanted them to look darker, when in reality, there's a mix. There are very dark and they're very, very light. And people don't get that.
It's like northern Italy as well. I mean, you'll have very blonde, very blue-eyed people.
Well, my mom's Sicilian, so I'm
okay,
both Southern. We're very close together. So how did it impact you as a journalist? I mean, you talk about in your book a little. You go to the Middle East, or Arabs see you when you're doing your journalism, but you don't look Arab to them in a way. How did that affect you? How did that affect you? And how did it affect within the world of media? Like, did it help or hurt you?
Well, look, I think you never know if anything has helped or hurt you when it comes to your ethnicity or your origin, because nobody's going to come up to you and be like, you know what, your name's a little weird. We're not going to put you on in prime time. So I don't know if it had an impact. I can only wonder if I had been more typically European or Western in my name and my origin and my kind of religion, whatever it is. Would that have made the path easier for me, or was it more of an uphill battle? I know, for instance, I write in the book that I was raised in France, and when I was sending out my resumes, and my friends were sending out their resumes as well, I had in my kind of other category the fact that I spoke Arabic. And I wasn't getting any callbacks. And a friend of mine from university said, listen, if I were you, I'd remove that because it might not be helping you, which is kind of abject when you think about it. And I did remove it, and I slapped on a picture, and I changed my name from Basha, which is my dad's name, to Gorani, which is my mom's name, which sounds more European, Italian, Balkan, whatever. And then I got a lot more callbacks. So, I mean, anecdotally, you can kind of come to the conclusion that perhaps having Arabic as a spoken language and a typically Arab-sounding name in France in the 90s, I don't know about now, wasn't necessarily an advantage.
You were born in one place, raised in others. You have this journey in the way looking for who you are. But I was taken back at one part in your book. You wrote November 2017. You got to be the first Arab American to host the show.
Yeah.
On prime time, on
yeah.
CNN International. So there was still a sense of pride. Like you knew.
Of course.
It's not like you're still an Arab American the whole time. So why did it matter to you? And why did you mention that in the book that you were the first Arab? Because you're absolutely true, and it's a great honor.
Yeah.
It's a testament to your work ethic.
Well, it's two things. First, people remind you of it. So you get a lot of, I'm so proud of you, from people you've never met.
Right.
Lebanese, Jordanian, Syrian. I think it's a part of the world that's going through a major crisis. And having someone who represents, in the eyes of people who are from there, accomplishment is something that they celebrate. And I never take that for granted. So I think for that reason, it's something that I don't, it's a part of me I don't forget. Second reason is Amin Maalouf, the Lebanese-French novelist and writer, amazing, said you recognize yourself most often in the most attacked facet of your identity. So if someone is more critical of the Arab side, for whatever reason, because you're lumped in with terrorists, because you're considered necessarily rejectionist, violent, whatever, then you hold on a little bit stronger to that part of your personality, of your identity, I should say, because that's where you feel that you need to prove yourself the most, to tell people that, no, you're wrong about this. You're wrong about this. How can hundreds of millions of people, all be cast in the same way or described with similar negative attributes?
Well, that comment really resonates with me because pre 9/11, I was really a white guy. and I tell people on September 10th, I went to sleep a white American. September 11th, I woke up an Arab. But in the post 9/11 world, as time went on, I get more and more in touch with my Arab heritage because the demonization of the community.
Yeah.
And even with my faith as a Muslim. My mom's Catholic, my dad's Muslim.
Yeah.
And as I went on, I gravitated more to Islam. And that was part of the demonization. You become emotionally invested in what you're defending.
Yeah, I think that's exactly how Amin Maalouf explains it, which is it's that part of that facet of who you are. For me, it's been more a question of trying to find, to explore that facet of my identity rather than embrace it more, because I've always been very international, very secular. I don't, non-practicing in the sense of religion, right. Though I can absolutely respect everyone's practice and everyone's religion, whatever it is. But for me, it's more a question of of going to try to figure out what the life of my great-great-grandmother was in the harem of the Sultan, something that I didn't necessarily feel was something I needed to do 20 years ago.
Sure, yeah. That's very interesting. So look, you've done a lot of work in the Middle East. You've covered war zones. What is it like? I mean, is there an emotional toll at times when you're seeing things that are just horrific? So
I've thought about this a lot. I've always thought of myself as someone who can compartmentalize horror in the sense that, I just came back from Rafah in Egypt, where I covered an evacuation flight of children wounded in Gaza. Some of them were amputees, completely traumatized children. And, you do that, you write the piece airs, you fly back to London, and then that night I have a dinner in a restaurant. And I'm able not to think about that. However, I will say that I think it lives somewhere in there. And with Syria, to give you an example, because Syria is where my family comes from, I think it did, in the end, take a huge mental health toll on me in the sense that I started really getting a lot more anxious and panicky at one point. And that was at the tail end of 6 or 7 years of really watching every frame of video coming from Syria. And I associate those two things. I think it's not that I immediately react. I think there is a delay. And when that happens, you put two and two together and you realize that a human brain is not designed to be exposed to this much misery and bloodshed every single day. And that's me. I can only imagine the people who are actually going through it and what they're experiencing and what kind of mental health toll that will take on them. But some of the most just hardened conflict reporters end up breaking down that are much tougher than me. So, and I'm not a conflict reporter in that sense that I don't go out and, cover only war. I do a whole lot of other stuff. But yeah, I think it does take its toll. And what I saw maybe on that flight, it's just that it went to the back of my head, and then another little piece will come on top of it and come on top of it, and one day it'll all come out and you'll start crying, or you'll start... For a while, I couldn't watch a single frame out of Syria. And when I was anchoring my show, I would take my earpiece out, because when there was a Syria story, because I couldn't hear any of the crying anymore. I couldn't do it. So I tell my producer, tell me, I'd be like, tell me when the story has 3 seconds left. And I'd put the earpiece back in, and then I'd go to the next story. There was a whole year where I had to do that.
I think we all find ways to cope with things that are truly unculpable. Like you shouldn't be exposed to it, and then that drumbeat continues. You've covered a lot of conflicts in the Middle East. Is this in Gaza? Is this different?
It's different in that we're not in Gaza. So there is definitely a push from my colleagues to get inside the Gaza Strip to be able to report. And this is not to say that the reporters on the ground aren't doing a heroic job. They really are. And there is absolutely no doubt that their work has brought to light some of what's going on inside of Gaza, but there needs to be independent international journalism happening inside Gaza right now. And it's not. And there have been letters written, appeals made, and yet that's not made any difference.
And who controls who can enter?
Well, you have the Egyptians controlling on one side, Rafah, the Israeli government as well, not allowing
And neither
access.
one will allow journalism?
You can go in. The Egyptians know. If you want to go into Gaza with the permission of the Israeli government, you go on what's called embeds, so embedded with the IDF.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you live in London now. When you see a coverage of the Middle East, of this conflict specifically, the one in Gaza now, is it different? I mean, I know you can't watch everything, and maybe there's the equivalent of the Fox News over there that shows a different side to it, but is international coverage of Gaza conflict different than what you see here in the States?
So I'll say one thing I've noticed is different. There have been other Israeli military operations and conflicts between Hamas and Israel over the last few decades. There was a really, really deadly one in 2014, but nothing has compared to what we're seeing now. I would say the biggest difference is the scale, obviously the destruction of the infrastructure and the residential buildings. There's that. There's the obviously death toll and horrific toll of injured and women and children killed as well. The biggest difference is that now the content coming out of Gaza is on social media.
Right.
So a lot of younger people, especially who are watching it on their apps, on their phones, are getting another side of the narrative, right? So it's a little bit different than 2014, where when you were getting your news, you were mainly getting it from kind of quote unquote legacy media organizations.
So, I mean, it's hard to say what the long-term impact of that is, but what do you think might be the impact of these sort of citizen journalists who are on the ground in real time sharing things? And what I see, like for example, on TikTok, it's peer-to-peer. It's a younger person in the States watching someone around their age in the Middle East, in Gaza, Palestinian generally, and saying, here's what we're going through. And it's having an impact on young people in the States. We see this.
I agree, and it's not just peer-to-peer, it's also big media organizations in the Middle East on social media platforms that are reaching younger people in Western countries. So you have another maybe view of the conflict reaching younger people who may not have seen it before social media was so widespread and available. So what that's doing is you're having a lot more seeing a lot more impact on public opinion in the younger generation of social media users. And you see it very, very clearly. I mean, the folks my age, for instance, much more likely to watch news as an appointment program, sit in front of their TV and stuff like that. It's very different to, say, my nieces who are in their 20s, who are on their phones all day and don't even own a TV. And they're seeing a lot more of the raw, unedited footage from a conflict zone.
How do you, as a journalist dealing with, say, the intensity of a conflict with Gaza, cut through what's misinformation or disinformation? And you might have Netanyahu peddling a certain propaganda. You might have Hamas wanting to say things to help their side. What do you do as a journalist? Well,
I will say one important thing here, and this is something that, of course, you'd expect a journalist to say. It is a skill. I mean, it's You do what you did before TikTok, invaded our airwaves and our phones. You check that this is factually correct. You check that it's the person who's quoted. who actually said this. Oftentimes you'll see a piece of video that's 3 weeks old presented as something that happened yesterday. You have to be careful. That takes time, and it takes skill. You make mistakes, don't get me wrong, we all do, but and when we do, we admit that we've made them. That's very important. But so that's how, I wouldn't say covering this conflict, though the scale is bigger, is different from covering Syria, for instance. And I think that you have to be just as precise and just as rigorous as when you do anything else. That's definitely, and again, I'll go back to saying that the journalists on the ground who have been feeding us and some of this content, without them, a lot of this work would be impossible. And the big media organizations do have production teams that they used to work with before October 7th who are still continuing to do the work on the ground. So there's also that.
It's interesting how people are getting, younger people, but also, it's also, because I studied the polls so much, you have younger people who view this conflict differently, but also older black people are viewing, and middle-aged black people are viewing this in the same way that younger people of all different backgrounds, and they're not watching TikTok.
Right.
So it's just, I think they come to the conflict with a different mindset.
Sure,
So,
yeah.
Let's talk to 2024 before we wrap up here. You wrote about covering Trump. I like this very much. You said, I had covered dictators, I had covered presidents in democracies before, but never a man with autocratic tendencies in a democracies. So what does the media do in 2024 covering a guy who will be the GOP nominee, barring something we don't expect, he'll be the nominee. They have to cover him.
Yeah.
But the guy aspires to be a dictator. He's running on retribution. He has pledged to use his DOJ to go after Biden and critics. It's things we've never seen before. So what do you do in the media?
Listen, I do not envy my friends in U.S. political journalism because it is such a tough job because it involves constant fact-checking. And so literally that becomes almost all you do. All you do is fact check, fact check, fact check. I think the most important thing, so my type of journalism, I'm not as interested in interviewing senators and congresspeople. I'm interested in going to the places in the US where there are lots of people who vote for somebody like Donald Trump. And I want to figure out what's going on. So I think the more we have that, and I think the more we understand the impulses that lead people. Also, what is it that is leading to such a mistrust of the mainstream, of the establishment? There is something there in America and in other parts of the world. Look at Viktor Orban in Hungary. Look at the situation in Poland. Look at how populist politics in France are gaining ground. Marine Le Pen is at over 40% approval rating in a country like France. What's going on there? People mistrust establishment politicians. They view them as corrupt. They view them as bought. They view them as not working for them. So is something like Trump, is Orban, are they the symptoms of that, or are they the cause of the problem? That's a question that I would ask myself. I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm just saying that's the question I would ask myself when I cover any extreme political movement. I mean, in the sense that it's on the fringes of the mainstream.
I mean, in the years you've done journalism, have you seen a political figure like Donald Trump in the United States where it's not just what he's saying, his supporters, and I've talked to some, will repeat what he has said. And there's no ability to fact check. There's nothing. It doesn't matter.
I'll tell you.
You get to 2 + 2 = 4. They go, nope, it's 5 because Donald said it was 5. And you're like, what do? I have no idea what I can say now.
So Trump is a particular character. He's like a character that someone has created for a film that you wouldn't have believed existed 10 years ago. But what he's saying is being said in other countries. For instance, look at Brexit in the UK. I mean, Brexit was always the decision to leave the EU by the UK. Always an emotional decision by voters. It was not based in fact, because for instance, you could say, oh, we don't want immigrants, but you could tell Brexit voters immigrants bring more in tax money than they take out in assistance and public assistance, and it wouldn't matter. So a non-rational, what I mean by that is a decision not supported by the facts cannot be then countered with facts, correct?
Right.
So this is the same thing, I think, in all the populist, emotional campaign messaging that we see in other parts of the world, where fact-checking is useful because it's journalistic and it's our job, But the purpose of it is not to convince anyone not to think the way they're thinking. That's not our job as journalists. Our job as journalists is to explain what leads people to vote in emotional ways. And that's what interests me. So, but I do see parallels between the messaging here and what I see in other parts of the Western world and beyond, by the way. I mean, look at other countries in Asia where you have people who are whipped into a frenzy, into a nationalist frenzy. You see it in many other places.
You're a journalist. Donald Trump has refused to denounce Vladimir Putin when asked point blank about him killing journalists. Mm-hmm. With Navalny, he has not criticized Putin at all, who was a pro-democracy activist, for being killed in a prison, while President Biden said he was murdered. He believes he was murdered by Putin. What are your concerns about that going forward?
Look, I don't think it'll be much different from the 4 years that Trump was in office in a foreign policy sense. Domestically, that I don't know. But in a foreign policy sense, I think it's going to be more of the same. I think my question would be, how will world leaders then react? Will they kind of a la Emmanuel Macron, try to placate him and be like, buddy, buddy? Or will they be, okay, here's a world leader that we have to kind of, work against?
I agree. It's also interesting what you mentioned, that how foreign leaders will look at him. If they go, okay, he won, but he can only be one term, so we just have to survive a few years. We build our own little coalition. Yeah, we leave the U.S. out. He can't. We have a 22nd Amendment, which I hope still will exist, that he can't run for another term.
It's possible. I know that in the same way the Ukraine war brought most European allies together, is it possible that if they feel there's some pushback by an eventual Trump administration, that will lead European partners closer together? I don't know. These are all kind of hypotheticals. We'll see. I don't know.
We'll see.
We have enough on our plate now. When we get to November, we'll have another discussion.
Well, Hala, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's But You Don't Look Arab, Hala Gorani. It was great chatting with you. Thanks for being on Salon Talks. I appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in to Salon Talks. I'm Dino Bidala.